Welcome to 7 Prophecies of the Future, a future studies program series that will take you on a transdisciplinary journey of discovery into the unknown. Each episode brings together 2 guests who will act as oracles, revealing a secret password to enter a realm filled with poetic images and intriguing phenomena. All oracles are part of a wider divinatory speculative endeavor, the Future Studies program. They will share the vaticinations of the future on the occasion of the Venice Biennial Virtual Pavilion 2021. I, Andrea Cetrullo, will be guiding you through the corridors that lead us to these oracles of futurity. On this episode, we will enter the domain of architecture, of worship and the sacred. Password, temple. Temple is defined as a building used to or for the worship of a god or gods in some religions. But what kind of deities can be found in these temples, and what sort of worshiper will build these structures of the future? To answer this and more, we have invited 2 oracles of futurity, Carla Leitão and Melamphy, both builders of real and imaginary temples. So welcome, Carla and Dan. I would like us to start this session by relaying the questions from our oracles of the previous episode of 7 Prophecies of the Future. So we'll start with Carla, and here goes Amy Ireland's challenge rather than questions, more of a challenge for Carla actually. It is commonly known that historically, in periods of great upheaval, innovation and religious groups effloresce or blossom. It is interesting that in the West, we have this narrative of technological civilization being connected to secularism. As we are starting to hit this enchantment of the world, I would like to challenge Carla to invent or imagine a sect, creed, order, cult, or church based on some kind of contemporary or future technology.
Mm-hmm. So many religions somehow believe in magic contiguity or continuity between humans and each other, or humans and something else. And also what they wish for others that could come true, like a curse or a blessing or something like that. And a belief that one's behavior can influence someone else's life. We know that that belief in those religions is actually broken, because many times we do not see the humans carrying it through, meaning making a maximum effort to abide by that criteria, that their behavior changes someone else's future. So a technology would have to be truly radical and therefore magical, a real definition of technology. It would have to be something like a drug, a brain redo, or a more effective and absolute hypnotism. Something beyond the already very radical idea of control of telepathy proposed by Alfred Bester in his novel, The Stars, My Destination, whereby humans have advanced levels of empathy because they can live in each other's minds. So this technology we would use for this new religion would have to be a new way to truly see energy and matter, per Einstein's non-distinction between energy and matter, and understand how that would change our ideas and absolute imagination about priority and hierarchy, and our following of the routines that celebrate it, knowing that it would be absolutely, it had to be the opposite of a dogma. And it would have to be as well uninterested in a past history, a cultural past history. And I bring this up because now that we've seen how much we've grown too close to each other on Earth right now, any future we have demands that we get our stuff together in that very radical way. So that's my response.
Thank you, Carla. It somehow brings us back to the previous episode, and actually Amy Ireland, one of her examples of futurity and mind reading. But for that, our spectators would have to go and rewatch that episode. For now, I'm going to welcome Dan and ask him, well, relay Ed's question. So Ed's question goes, if we dig deep, very, very deep, perhaps towards the center of the earth, or perhaps far out into time, What foundations might we find? What most primitive algorithms might govern and constitute the rules which form the temples we have seen across history, and also the temples we might build today? What forms of societies, politics, biology, love, and mind would these temples make possible?
Demons, genies, hello Nora, have shown, that is demonstrated to us throughout the various fabulous tales that have come down to us over the ages, that when one is summoned, one should always be very aware and wary of who has summoned us. And to sum up a genealogical mode of operation, try to fold the requests or questions of the summoner back onto the quester, questioner, requester, in sum onto the summoner. In this case, Summoned as I Am by Ed Keller, I should say first off that the man climbs mountains, climbs hillsides, rock faces, Sisyphean boulders, what have you, and hence has a keen sense of the vertiginous relation between great heights and great depths. What's more, if you read through his collected writings, you'll find that his penchant for scaling cliff sides translates itself into a consistent collective works working and wording out of scalability, since he tends to explore issues from the most macrocosmic to the most microcosmic scale in his essays, and from the most profoundly chthonic to the loftiest levels of the macrocosmic. So he himself is probably best suited in both his flesh suit and mind tux to answering the question he has posed. Taking a cue from Cronenberg Jr.'s horror movie Possessor, I could simply don the Ed personam, the Kellerian hypokeimenon, and ventriloquize. I could lift a passage at random, say for instance, the opening lines of his contribution to Leper Creativity, where he writes of, quote, the fraught relationship between the sun and the earth within a broader cosmologically scaled economy of excess and consumption, of overlapping layers of time where futures and pasts are enabled and erased, unquote. Quote, what is the manner by which humans can position themselves in relation to this excessive and enabling or erasing machine, unquote. So that resounds of his question today. What is the manner by which, or what are the primitive algorithms that might govern and constitute the rules which form the various positions and dispositions, the various perspectives, perspectival frameworks, architectural arrangements and assemblages that enable and or erase takes on the world, takes on or ways of contemplating the world, the very conditions of the contemplum, the temple in, through, out of which all forms of society, politics, biology, etc. are made possible. So here I've remixed a lot of Ed Keller, leprously lopping off lines from his punctum book, Cyclonopedia Analysis, and his FSP summoning question. To switch from a demonic to a perhaps more angelic approach, let me answer this call, this Cthulhu-like summons, with part of a book we were translating at the time of the Cyclonopedia Festival, namely Simondon's elaboration of his assemblage theory on the mode of existence of technical objects and religio-technological subjects. What Ed calls the primitive algorithms, indeed the foundations that govern and constitute, Simondon calls the primitive, indeed magical schema that maps or lays out the world through a set of key contemplative perspectival points. In his treatise on the mode of existence, Simondon's basic hypothesis, in his own words, quote, consists in supposing the existence of a primitive mode of man's relation to the world, which is the magical mode, a la Carla, what you just said. From an internal rupture of this relation arise two simultaneous and opposite phases, the technical phase and the religious phase. Technicity is the mobilization of the figural functions, the extraction of key points of man's relation to the world, and religiosity, on the other hand, refers to respect for and the perspective of ground functions. Aesthetic thought preserves the nostalgia of man's primitive relations to the world. It is a neutrality between the opposing faces, but its concrete character as a constructor of objects limits its power of mediation. For the aesthetic subject loses its neutrality and consequently its power of mediation by seeking to become either functional or sacred, unquote. Quote, according to this general hypothesis, he continues, and I'm using Cecile Mataspina's translation rather than our old rough draft version, that is to say the now officially published translation. Hi, Cecile. We suppose that the primitive mode of existence of man in the world corresponds to a primitive union prior to any split of subjectivity and objectivity. The first structuration, corresponding to the appearance of a figure and a ground in this mode of existence, is the one that gives rise to the magical universe. The magical universe is structured according to the most primitive and meaningful organizations, that of the reticulation of the world into privileged spaces and privileged moments. A privileged place a place that has power, is one that summarizes and contains the force of a compact mass of reality. It summarizes and governs it, as a highland governs and dominates a lowland. The magical world is thus made of a network of places and things that have power, mag, the root of the word magic, and that are bound to other things and other places that also have power. This path, this enclosure, this temenos, contains all the force of the land, the key point of the reality and spontaneity of things, unquote. It's kind of a long quote, but sorry. So the temple here can be taken as one such temenos, as one such high point, qua key point, or what Ed himself might call a bouldering, mountaining hand or foothold. It is a place that allows us to grasp, to hold and behold the larger picture, if you will, the whole complex of things, objects and subjects, or in the more primary, primitive case, prior to this stark division of objects and subjects. So that's my answer to Ed. Kind of long, but there you are.
Thank you so much, Dan. There's a lot to unpack there, but I believe your answer to this question doesn't stop there. It will be complemented by the first example of this oracular session, which is the myth. Is that right, Dan?
Yep. The roots of the word temple are uncertain, that is to say contested. But the three dominant hypotheses, the contested A, B, and C threads, are A, that it derives from the Greek temenos, designating a section of land cut or marked off from the rest, a sacred enclosure, a sacred space set aside from other mundane locations. B, that it stems from the Latin tempus, meaning time, and demarcates an alternative time or time out marked or set out for contemplation, for contemplative practice. And C, that it comes from the Proto-European templum, meaning to stretch or to extend. The word temple in French, temple, resounds of the second thread. Each thread has a thread extending the third one, which actually is a thread stretched out or stretched over space and or time. Temple in French resounds of a time, un temps, a climatological condition, le temps, peut-être la tempête, et aussi la température. In this case, a time or temporal condition set aside from the rest. The condition of a time out or an out of time that is within, with an end, the very definition and delimitation of the temple. The temple thus enfolds time. It is in itself un templier, a folded and enfolded time. And place, of course, folded and enfolded time and place, or set aside space-time. This folding, this unfolding, accords with all three hypothesized etymologies, A, B, and C. I have a lot to say about folds from the fact that this is what the body does, what bodies do, and that this is the key to self-consciousness and self-reflection. Indeed, all explication, every complication, every complex notion we have and have ever come up with, to a whole set of other physical, metaphysical, and downright pataphysical considerations. But rather than get all Leibnizian and Deleuzian, or again, Jarry-esque about it, I figured I should stay grounded in and on the temple itself and remain in this way a kind of Templar, perhaps even a bit of a devilish or demonic Templier, who knows. Speaking of lying, that which lies at the root of the temple is utterly and or unutterably interesting and definitely worth folding into this particular rant or thieves' cant. I'll mention two things, two examples with respect to this, referring first to the Hindu temple, for instance, the temple of Meenakshi, Parvati in Madurai, and secondly to the Egyptian temple, for instance, the temple of Luxor, ancient Thebes in the middle of Egypt along the banks of the Nile. Actually, I'll reverse these. I'll refer first to the Egyptian temple and then to the Hindu temple. One of the interesting things about the building of Egyptian temples is the so-called seed stone that is literally planted at the outset, the beginning of construction. This is a stone taken from the walls of an earlier temple that has fulfilled its calendrical, astrological, that is to say temporal purpose, and been dismantled. This is an example of the temple as a templier or folded time, since here the previous time, the previous temple, is folded into and enfolded by the new one. The new temple is founded on and grows out of the old through a kind of lithographic gene splicing. And even the hieroglyph marked face of the older stone section is taken into account with respect to the newfound foundational position or countenance, since it is always planted face downward so that the text can grow down in and as the direction of the roots and root the new building. Other stones from the significant and symbolically chosen old temple often get placed at various points, various joints and junctures in the newly built temple, appearing at what might be perceived as odd parts of the hieroglyph covered walls. But why go to the trouble of incorporating these odd bits and pieces into the new temple if they are not somehow significant, if they did not somehow carry elements of the old temple into the new? Many examples of these can be found in the 3-volume study of Luxor, published in 1957 as Le Temple de l'Homme, a 3-volume study that makes reference to and extends in the direction of Egypt, Stella Kramrich's 2-volume study published in 1946 as the Hindu Temple. Both studies, however, refer to the Hindu architectural principle as the Vastapurusha Mandala, which is the seed, plan, base, and basis of divinely and environmentally attuned architecture. That is to say, architecture that allows for and folds into itself this worldly, mundane, and otherworldly divine forces and flows. Whereas figures such as Leonardo's Vitruvian Man mandala are based on a body with outstretched arms and legs, limbs extended to their maximum range. The man form, qua Purusha, of the Vastapurusha Mandala, or Vedic man rather than Vitruvian man, if you like, is by contrast compacted, confined by rather than configuring the mandala, or seed form, plan, basis as such. It is unextended, in other words, rather than in a state of extension. Extension in the Vedic vision, the Vastapurusha Mandala, gives rise to the building that is based on and grows out from the basic mandala, a building that stands as an extensive symbol of the latter. The mandala itself remains purely intensive. Extension in the Vedic vision takes the form of a dismemberment, following Book 10 of the Rig Veda. As Joseph Reichert explains in his dancing column on order and architecture, quote, in the 19th hymn of the Rig Veda, which is actually the 90th hymn, he might have made a mistake or there's a typo there. Now, in the 90th hymn of the Rig Veda, there's a suggestion that the creation of the cosmos and society comes about through the sacrificial dismembering of Purusha, the first man, unquote. Or quoting Stella Kramrich, the Purusha sacrifices itself into existence. It spends itself in an ever renewed and ever proceeding sacrifice by which the universe and its existence subsist. Sacrifice, sacer facere, a making sacred by division, divestment, dissection. Purusha, the man in the mandala, as the body out of which and out from which existent things, objects and subjects, unfurl, unfold, come to be. Purusha begins intact, whole, altogether, and ends up altogether dispersed, distributed, doled out, rolled out, as the map and territory terrain topos of the world. So these are the images on that sheet. The long temple of Egypt, the temple of Luxor in the middle there. I think on the left, the various versions of the Vastapurusha Mandala. And then on the right, I can't see it, but some other graphics that appeared in an essay I published for the Funambulist on the Hindu temple. There you are. So that's my mythic image.
Thank you very much, Dan. Now, Carla, what is your mythic example of temple and futurity?
So, Dan, thank you very much for that amazing introduction to temples and their etymology. And thank you for talking about the Egyptians or Egyptian culture, because that allows me to bring some cats into the picture. So I bring a very awkward concept of temple, especially being an architect. This is not what you expect from me. But you see, these days, architects are very interested in landscapes and the way we inhabit spaces in landscapes through knowledge. The RayCat project I bring was an early biosensor project to read landscapes. The project of genetically engineering a domestic cat so that it would change color in the presence of certain radioactive substances. It was the response by French author François Bastide and semiotician Paolo Fabri to the problem of how to identify the presence of nuclear waste and its invisible storage to discontinuous or very far in time generations of civilizations. In the words of Abraham van Leeuwenhoek, it was a way of warning civilizations that are so far after anyone that you ever cared about has died. The problem of how to create these long time warning messages was implemented in the last quarter of the 20th century through the Human Interference Task Force, a group of thinkers around the US Department of Energy and the Bechtel Corporation, with the goal of designing a way of preventing humans from unintentionally intruding on radioactive waste isolation areas. The RayCat concept lives on the shoulders of other ideas that look into how to create persistence of memory in human beings across cultures and time. Some of those ideas included the proposal by linguist Thomas Sibiok of creating an atomic priesthood. a group or council that would preserve the knowledge of these messages and its own longevity as a panel of experts. Here, in the Ray cat, the biology was seen as a mode of entertaining longevity. The cat would continue to breed more biosensing units. But cultural proximity to cats, which has endured for a long time, would entertain the possibility that this quality would not be forgotten, the message embodied by the cat, as well as that it would always be visible. They would always be close by humans. Models and criteria for these long-term warnings evolved to acknowledge relative risks and expectations of recovery ambition to the messages. There were even mandates that explain all that. With the EPA mandate in the 1990s, for instance, to create these warnings as part of these storage facilities emerged the real-time lines around radioactive decay, hundreds of thousands and millions of years. And the settling after that on just 10,000 years for the regulatory mandate that these facilities should design for, both in terms of their conservation as well as their messaging systems. The RayCat project is a project from the past, the 80s, that would make use of a technology from the future, which we don't have yet, to communicate with a very deep future, which we have no idea what it will be. It's a deep, ultra-ethical project. It relied on both the extreme familiarity, the cat as a pet, and stories about it as rhymes to help remember, and rituals, of course, of affectionate behavior from both species, as well as a kind of a universal language that may exist to communicate with entities that we had no capacity to understand. The RayCat, much like the messaging into space, focuses on a viewpoint or perspective which is extraterrestrial as we know it, and to a certain degree omnipresent. It focuses on the ability to communicate transculturally, and in that way find some level of universality in the medium, which could translate into universality on the message, which we can imagine has some transethical or ultra-ethical dimension. The project of planetary unity as one that is simultaneously deeply human and non-human, so very sacred. And the project is also aware of the tsunami warning stones of the Anioshi village, some of them 6 centuries old, and the often forgotten nature of their message. Douglas Rushkoff reminds us of the lost art of the pattern recognition as we skip generations, cultural forms, and rely on newer technological artifacts, such as measurements, alarms, and predictions, that nevertheless may lack an history of observation and local mapping and marking that accumulated local generational knowledge and may be more foolproof about. These constructs are supposed to explain on our behalf when we can no longer distinctly speak, or when we don't know, can't perceive, nor imagine who we are talking to, nor, as in the space messages, whether they exist or will come. They are comments on what we think are more or less mute landscapes. Much like quadridimensional facades, they aim to manifest, conjure, make visible, incomprehensible and invisible aspects of the technological magic we have created and which are now unrecognizable to most of us due to their nature and scale. Yes.
Thank you, Carla. Always a good omen to see cats, so really for that. And now, Dan, I think we can move on to our second image thought, which is the artistic image. And I believe you chose it's a clip that we're going to share. Yeah. And I will show this, and then you can proceed, comment.
Sure. Okay. So contemporary contortionism. Not only is the contortionist who can fit his or her body into the tight container, into a very tight container, a rather mesmerizing 3-dimensional example of the compacted Vastapurusha mandala, but the very word contortionist, from the Latin contortus, designating a twisting along with or a folding along the lines of, twists and folds itself into and onto our basic thematic topos, the temple, and its temps-pliés. The contortionist here folds his body into and out from tight places, spaces where the good old Vitruvian body shouldn't fit. In this little video, the yogic contortionist Roman Cricelli unfurls and unfolds his arms, legs, etc. from a compact glass cube. Prior to his unfolding, he looks like the Vastapurusha in its mandala. The Vastapurusha too is encased, enfolded into a tight square container, in this case, pun intended, as the model for the building or structure that is based upon it, from which or for which it is the basis. This relates both to the Hindu temple and to the Egyptian one, even to the extended temple rather than unextended plans of a temple like Luxor, the extended plan of which has three main folds, three bent axes, of which I will speak in a moment. First though, in the little video here provided, which you're currently watching, yogic contortionist Roman Cricelli starts off encased in a square, or rather cubic, enclosure, a tight temenos, which holds him, which compactly encases him, and contains in this way all the forces of his body. All that emerges from this box, not a black box, but rather an entirely visible and lisible one, a box the contents of which can clearly be seen or surveilled. Through the looking glass, one can behold the whole thing. All that will unfold from there, if you get me. All right then, so proceeding from the Vastapurusha mandala and the encased Cricelli, along with the post-encasement creaking of the Cricelli body's bones, of the whole skeletal structure as it emerges uncompacted from the constraints of that enclosure, let's cast a brief glance at the extended rather than the compacted skeletal structure of the Egyptian temple of Luxor, harkening back to the first image of this presentation, which might be in your mind, maybe not, prior to the contortionist vid, which is currently playing. Okay then, just as the classic Hindu temple arose and unfolded out from a compact and intensive anthropomorphic model, the Egyptian temple of Luxor arose and unfolded according to an extended and instead uncompacted, that is to say stretched and drawn out anthropomorphic model, leading the French scholar and symbolist René Schwaller, following after the work of the Austrian Stella Kramrich and her studies of the Vastapurusha mandala, to call this Theban temple, the temple of Luxor, the temple of man. The man here likely being the idealized pharaoh, since the temple of Luxor is dedicated to the eternal rebirth or rejuvenation of kingship, likely the place where pharaohs were crowned. Quote, the architecture of the temple of Luxor is at first glance disconcerting. From the southern sanctuary to the northern pylons, the axis along which it is set never ceases to deviate. There is scarcely a regular shape in the plan. What seems square is rhomboidal. The intercolumnal spacing increases occasionally in the direction of the sanctuary. Moreover, the entire construction was carried out in several phases, unquote. Indeed, the temple construction spanned the reigns of Amenhotep III, Tutankhamun, Horemheb, and Ramses II along three distinct principal axes. The disconcerting contortions and deviations of the temple's successive sections and various inner subsections correspond, according to Schwaller's 12-year on-site examination, to the various parts and organs of the human body. Quote, the study of these axes shows that each correspond to a purpose. Each axis is a theme that rules the direction of the constructions related to it. In fact, each wall was built in relation to one or another of these axes with no regard to the obvious disorder that would ensue. Thus, we have here a discovery that is extremely important for the studying of the architecture of the temples and for deciphering the meaning of the pictures and texts traced on their walls, unquote. The correspondences to the human body were found to be as follows, quote, the head is located in the sanctuary of the covered temple area with the oral cavity in the area of the bark of Amun. The clavicles are marked by walls. The chest is located in the first hypostyle of the covered temple and ends in the temple's platform. The abdomen is represented by the peristyle court, and the pubis is located exactly at the door separating the peristyle from the colonnade of Amun, which is dedicated to the femurs, the thighs. The knees are at the site of the gate, in front of which stand the two colossi, marking the entrance to this colonnade. The tibias are in the court of Ramses, whose legs, tibias, are particularly pronounced. The little toe falls exactly at the northwest angle of the pylon. Any human skeleton, as long as it is harmonious, can be projected onto the plan of the temple and will coincide with it. All the proportions of the skeleton may be checked against the actual measurements of the temple, unquote.
Great, Dan. Carla, would you share an artistic image that has captivated you and that somehow encapsulates our conceptual password temple?
My now image. So Testbed, that's the name of a project, is a more recent 2017 proposal by Tay Carpenter, Ariana Dean, and Ashley Kuhl for one of those long-term warning messaging systems I was talking about in the first one. The RayCat was an early precursor to the same problem. The testbed is a 12,000 by 12,000 by 9,500 cube that transforms a nuclear waste storage facility area, the waste isolation pilot plant, into a climate engineering experiment site. Rather than communicating with a warning through monument or obstacle, the project manipulates the geology of the site itself by setting in motion an open-ended assemblage of processes that generate an entangled scientific earthwork comprised of agitated hybrid formations, neither natural nor human-made. Testbed is a very different approach of a previous concept of installing scary spikes across the top of the storage area in Landscape of Thorns in the 1992 by Michael Brill and Safdar Abidi. But spikes, much like other scary symbols, can become softened through time, and in this case, through erosion across deep timelines on pure matter. Testbed, the project, is a radical proposal. It deploys this array of carbon dioxide capturing strategies across the website, including ex situ mineral sequestration, in situ geologic storage, and direct air capture farms to generate this active marker system that passively stores one type of energetic product, or byproduct rather, carbon dioxide, in the surface that is above another, the transuranic waste that is secured below. By using climate engineering to create a new geology, Testbed takes advantage of the site's already compromised condition to encumber it through experimentation, doubling down on this disturbance to ensure that the site will remain undisturbed. Through their continued growth and transformation over time, these new geological forms mark the site as something that is deeply strange and unfamiliar, communicating an otherness by intervening in a fundamental process that is taking place around it. So if Testbed is a monument or a temple or a message or a narrative, it does so by relying on an identifiable dynamic image rather than a permanent one. It addresses permanence and stickiness of message by following natural processes and by exacerbating their expression in ways that become visible visually, chemically, and environmentally, potentially addressing several kinds of sensing intelligence of different perspectives. It communicates a permanent presence by, albeit its blurry borders or limits, revealing a continuing, dynamically changing relationship with everything else around it. So that's my now image.
Excellent. And finally, I will ask Dan to reveal his last vaticination of the day in the form of an emerging phenomenon relating temple to futurity.
Right. So yes, my last one has to do with origami or origami, the art of folding. The Japanese word ori means folding, and the Japanese word kami means paper. Hence, origami or origami is the art of folding paper, the art of paper folding. Technorigami, technical or technological origami, known in Japan as origami seke, is an origami design approach wherein and whereby novel origami models can be theoretically plotted out before any actual folding occurs. Robert Salazar, a contractor intern at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, explained the significance of origami in the tech world as follows, quote, origami offers the potential to take a very large structure, even a vast structure, and fit it into relatively small spaces. for instance, into a small rocket, from which, after launch, it can then deploy back out again, unquote. That is, from which it can be folded out once again to its actual unfolded operational size. Quote, folding a large object into a relatively small space is not a simple task. A big challenge in origami design in general is that because all the folds share a single resource, a single sheet, everything is highly interdependent. So if you change just one feature, it has an impact on everything else, unquote. According to NASA jet propulsion technologist Manan Arya, folding an object the size of a baseball diamond so that it could fit into a rocket is the goal of a NASA project called Starshade. Once it opens in space, Starshade would allow a space telescope to better see planets around bright stars. Quote, seeing an exoplanet next to its parent star is like trying to image a firefly next to a searchlight, the searchlight being the star. Starshade seeks to block out that starlight so you can image any really faint exoplanet right next to it, unquote. The key principle used in technical origami is origamic tessellation, which came into being in the 1960s. Tessellation as in covering a surface with tile-like patterns, tiling it, along the folds of which a two-dimensional shape can be converted or contorted into a three-dimensional one. The most famous example of origamic tessellation is the so-called Miura Fold, which was developed in the 1970s by a Japanese astrophysicist who worked on solar arrays for the JAXA Satellites Corporation. Using the Miura Fold, one can fold a piece of paper into a smaller area and then unfold it again in a single movement. When unfolded, the Miura pattern looks like a mosaic made of rows of parallelograms. Miura folds are an example of what is called rigid origami, wherein the facets of the Miura origami structure remain flat and deflection only happens along the tessellated folds. So to fold things together here, the word tessellation and the tessellated comes to us from the Latin word tessera, a cube like Roman Circelli's glass box, or like the six-sided dice Lord Shiva used in his game against Parvati, a game where he gambled away all his attributes, all his extensions, and in doing so replicated the dismemberment of Purusha, whose body parts gave rise to the world as we know it.
Engineers are turning to origami for inspiration for all types of applications, from medical devices to space applications, and even stopping bullets. But why is it that this ancient art of paper folding is so useful for modern engineering?
This is a folded pattern. It's called a triangulated cylinder. It is bistable, meaning it's stable in two positions. This is one, and then if I give it a twist, this is the other. This really has a bunch of bistable mechanisms in it because you can see how it sort of pops into place. But if you combine the two mechanisms going in different directions, then you get the sort of magical color change effect.
Yeah, that's impressive.
So you look at this and you say, okay, that is a cute paper toy. Is it anything more than that? And the answer is yes.
Does that turn into that?
That turns into that, yep. We're working with a company called Intuitive Surgical that does the Da Vinci surgical robot, where they wanted to be able to insert a flexible catheter with the robot, but the flexible catheters tend to buckle and stuff. So we had developed these origami bellows that if you look down there, there's a hole that no matter how far we move this, that stays the same size on the inside. And what that means is we can put the catheter in there, and as the catheter moves and is getting inserted into the body, it still has supports along the way.
By cutting or scoring materials and adding hinges as necessary, thick, rigid materials can, in effect, be folded. This is useful, for example, in deploying solar panels.
This pattern is perhaps the granddaddy of deployable structures. It's called the Miura Ori. It's been used for solar arrays. In fact, it was one of the first patterns that flew on a space mission back in 1995. It was called the Space Flyer mission. As you see here, it all opens and closes in a single motion, and when it flattens, it's very thin and compact.
It's a fun pattern called the origami flasher, and you get this kind of interesting flasher motion.
This has been proposed as a design for satellite solar arrays, increasing compactness for launch and reliability in deployment. Functional motions of origami are inspiring new designs for devices, like compliant mechanisms that can complete full 360-degree rotations.
Unlike a traditional mechanisms with, bearings or hinges, I can hook on a motor and I can get continuous revolution. I couldn't do that with a compliant mechanism. But it turns out no one bothered to tell the paper folders that, and created a continuously revolving compliant mechanism, which is called a kaleidocycle.
Origami motions are also being used in medical devices.
These would be, the creases in the paper.
There you go. That's good
Okay,
enough.
I think we get the gist.
It's fine.
No, it's pretty cool. I had never seen it before. Had you, Carla? Did you know about?
Because of being an architect,
That's right.
this is very much like that's in front of us. So there will always be a studio or two that works with folding to work with geometry. You understand where geometry can go, yeah.
So how's your origami then? Are you good at it?
No, I love, and I actually, there's a beautiful, an app that is actually to play paper origami, but in an app form. It's called Kami. It's highly addictive. It's beautiful, cool. It's about problem solving. It's problem solving folds. It's a kind of a mathematics exclusion problem. Like you can only solve something in 5 moves or something like that. And it's based on Japanese folding. Japanese paper folding. Yes, with the tessellations. Exactly. I have a thing here to mention that. Yeah, no, but this is very exciting, this kind of research on geometry that sometimes it does feel like magic because it seems impossible, but it's actually just, literally it's mathematics. Yeah, it's just very difficult to see in any other way than this visual one. Even when you see it visually, it seems magic.
Apart from the origami, what do you envision as the perfect representation of the future and the temple?
Main slide, yes, okay. To ask one to bring an image of an emergent phenomena is akin to ask for someone to hunt fire and bring its head as evidence. So I would like to bring an anti-temple temple, a Tower of Babel of sorts. This is the work of a collective work of several anonymous fake Pokemon cards artists, which name themselves the Interoceptors. The Interoceptors believe there's a great babbling entity that one day will connect the perception of individual human body and mind with the perception of a healthy universal space where they assemble collectively and expand into other dimensions. More than a child's game or a wild card, the Interoceptor is a dynamic card that believes its imperfect starting health factor on the top right that can be modified by continuing to play its same choice of attacks. The Babble Whipper, which constantly waits 3 turns to actually play, or the Backlash Twist, which only adds energy at the cost of 5 times more damage, including to itself. And this is also known as the under the rug attack, the under the rug sweep attack. Like the archetypal Tower of Babel, it is a construction that clearly did not set out with a perfect plan and dimensions, and therefore did not think about foundations. It did not know how it wanted to relate and structure itself with some kind of pre-existing condition, a history, a geology, a set of principles. Rather, it was about a spiral of pure levitation, ever upwards, potentially sinking the bottom in and itself through the sheer pressure of matter at the expense of energy, of shifting reliabilities on different soils and of shifting reliabilities on different expertise. Georges Bataille in The Accursed Share argues that we should focus on waste in all forms and not equilibrium. He describes the extravagant waste by societies on temples, pyramids, and cathedrals, along with war or waste of life in rituals in primitive societies. And he links this need for waste with the accretion of energy, which creates a surplus that must be released. The ritual of potlatch, gift giving, or the construction of extreme luxurious works of architecture is a mode to channel such release within cultural forms. Scenes that we've imagined of our futures talk in different ways of ourselves as past. Paraway imagines our dead human and technological bodies as the shells waste of the future, what we have built in order to build something else that will no longer work in the future, but which was what we were focused on. Arguing that we should think of the future in terms of those shells that we built to build other things. What we really create and leave on the way to creating the things we want to. And Lovelock does something similar in terms of intelligence, proposing that something more ethical than us, created by us, can be created to take care of us, nearly positing a future Earth with our survival as part of its stewardship project. So our survival is an important thing to preserve, a sort of a higher temple where we all fit together. So there are myriad versions of this card right now being played all over online, all with subtle differences between them so that only experts can spot them. This example, for instance, has lost its V, big V, which would give it Vmax force. This is a completely reasonable strategy of game theory. Faithful to their fate, the interceptors believe that if this kind of upward spiraling motion of attacks is great enough, the tower will actually find a foot, so to speak, and settle like a badly turned wedge, floating in the debris of its own creation. So that's my emergent phenomenon.
Basically, I will ask you to summon 2 oracles for the following episode and ask them a question related to their conceptual passcode, which will be rain. They will be answering on the next episode of 7 Prophecies of the Future. Carla, would you like to ask a question or summon these oracles?
Yes, so I think I'm reading the question to both Arshin and to Nandita. And the question is, thinking about differences between reign and governance, is there ever a way to imagine a benevolent king, reigning, governing entity? And if we could design it, so to speak, what would it look like?
Okay, well, we shall wait until the next episode for that to be revealed. But in the meantime, thank you so much